Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes, Abraham and Ishmael, and the Scapegoat, Child Sacrifice, Part 2. In this decoding, we're going to pick up where we left off in our previous decoding, the Oracle Decodes, Abraham and Isaac, Child Sacrifice, and Daylight Savings Time. So if you haven't at least watched that piece, it's going to help a lot if you go do that first before getting into this decoding, where we're going to cover a whole lot in just this one piece. Now, there are many reasons why the story of Abraham and his two sons are very important overall. The primary reason that we're looking into this in depth is that when we decoded Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac, it was this act that led Abraham to becoming the quote-unquote father of these nations. First Judaism, then Christianity, and then later on Islam. So it's in this one story of Abraham that's central, that's found first in the Torah or the Bible in the book of Genesis, and then there's another later version that you can find in the Quran of Abraham's story. So it's this central story that is the tie between these three famous faiths, collectively known as the Abrahamic religions. And it's also in this story that one of the main points of disagreements about the story arises between what Christian believers believe and Jewish believers believe about the story of Abraham and what the believers of Islam believe. So the main point of contention is which son of Abraham's was he asked to sacrifice by God? Was it Ishmael or was it Isaac, as we found in the Bible and have already previously decoded? Well, here we're going to get into looking at the story of Abraham and Ishmael. That would be Abraham's other son, his firstborn son, according to most sources. So again, we're going to try to keep with freely available sources online just to make it easier for you to verify everything that I'm showing you here. So we're going to start out by taking a look at the New King James Version of the Bible. You can find this at a website called BibleGateway.com. So chapter 16 of the book of Genesis says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife." And already I'm going to interject here. It's only later in the story does God change their names from Sarai and Abram to Sarah and Abraham. But here in chapter 16 of the book of Genesis, that hasn't happened yet. So they're still called Sarai and Abram in the story. All right, so starting over. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant. And maidservant is just a nice way to say slave. So you can also read this as Egyptian slave, whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See how the Lord has restrained me from bearing children? Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband to be his wife, after Abram dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. So let's stop there. Why would Sarai devise this plan in the first place to have a baby? Since we all might read this story and wonder, well, what did Sarai think was going to happen, right? I mean, just thinking about it, isn't pretty much every woman's reaction to even the thought of another woman being with her husband make her feel extremely hurt, angry, and perhaps jealous, even if it seemed to be all her idea in the first place, right? Well, in the story of Abraham, we have to know that God had previously already promised that Abram and Sarai would be the parents of the descendants of many. They were nations of descendants, right, as it turns out to be. But God made that promise to Abram and Sarai while they were coming out of Egypt. So that was back in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis. So quite a while from where we are now in chapter 16. And Sarai and Abram at this point are growing older now and still no baby. So they obviously were doubting God's earlier promise made to them about having a baby, right? That's required to have these many descendants. So this is why Sarai and Abram devised this plan of their own, you can see. They were, trying through desperate measures to make God's promise be fulfilled through them no matter what. So they took matters into their own hands, in other words. Genesis chapter 16, verse 5 goes on. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you." So now she's angry. "I gave my maid into your embrace. When she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hands. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So something else to note here is that in Genesis chapter 16, it seems to be emphasized to the reader that Hagar is not only Sarai's slave or bondwoman or maidservant, she's also Egyptian, something that was emphasized more than once. Now, the reason why I think that this treatment of Hagar in the story was written to be harsh is because even earlier in the story of Abram and Sarai that I hinted toward, when Sarai was the young and very beautiful wife of Abram, they both fled to Egypt. They were fleeing from famine. So they ended up being foreigners then in the land of Egypt. And Abram, knowing that his wife's beauty would likely catch the eye of the leaders or the Pharaoh there in Egypt, he asks Sarai to lie to everyone they meet, saying that they are only brother and sister, hoping that this will keep them both safe from harm. And in the story, I'm just summarizing things here, it works. Abram is treated well by the Pharaoh. And in Egypt, Sarai is taken by the Pharaoh and brought into the Pharaoh's house because of her beauty. That is until a plague strikes Egypt. And the Pharaoh attributes this to punishment for taking another man's wife, having found out that Sarai really was Abram's wife after all and not his sister. So he throws them both out of Egypt. So this is all coming from the story that begins in Genesis chapter 12. So here in chapter 16 of the book of Genesis, we can see now this is a tables being turned kind of story. Now it's the foreigner, the Egyptian bondwoman Hagar, the young and beautiful slave, right? The Egyptian slave that Sarai is giving to her husband to conceive a child because she feels that she's too old. Now, remember, she's trying to fulfill God's promise to them. But they thought that God needed help to deliver on this promise to them about a baby. But here, we can see that already a theme is pretty well developing at this point about the idea of the scapegoat in the story of Abram, Sarai, and now Hagar. So after Hagar fled from Sarai because of her harsh treatment, Genesis chapter 16, verse 7 goes on. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitudes." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall have a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction." Now, note the name of Ishmael means God has heard or God has hearkened. So this is what's meant by, in this story, the angel of the Lord says to Hagar about naming her son, right? Because God has heard her affliction. It goes on. "He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." Genesis chapter 16 ends with verse 15. "So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." So we're going to remember a few of these details as we go forward, but much of what we're reading here from this point, we are going to save for a future decoding when we get back to the later story of Ishmael and his mother Hagar after they've been cast out into the desert. All right, so now we're going to jump to Genesis chapter 21, where Abram's second son, Isaac, is born. And the Lord visited Sarah. Note now that God has changed Sarai's and Abram's names. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, specifically in this story about the changing of names and the name meanings being woven into these stories as further symbolism. All right, so, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, as God commanded him. And we are also going to get into looking deeper into things like circumcision and this covenant in future decodings as well. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born, according to the Bible, and Abraham was 100 when his son Isaac was born. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. You want to also note that Isaac, the name Isaac, means he who laughs. So again, the name meaning is woven into the story, making sense as Sarah is laughing about Abraham being 100 years old and her being 90 years old and them conceiving a child after all. Another thing to note is that we learned when Ishmael, Abraham's first son, was born, Abraham was 86, and 100 years old when his second son, Isaac, was born. So that's a time span of 14 years. So we want to take note that this tells us that Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael, was 14 years old when Isaac was born. All right, so keep that in mind. We're going to get back to that in a little bit here. Genesis chapter 21, verse 8 goes on. After Isaac's birth is where we're at here. So the child was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Now in other older versions, the word chosen is laughing instead of scoffing. And remember, the name Isaac means he who laughs. So this connection also makes sense, as the name meaning is woven again into the story. But scoffing is meant to be negative, even if laughing doesn't connote the same negative connotation. It is a negative one nonetheless. So verse 10 goes on. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. So again, take note of that. That's an interesting choice to say here, namely with Isaac. So a lot of pointing to names and name meanings. Verse 11 goes on. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. Again, notice this continuing theme of the scapegoat that's happening all throughout the story. Verse 12 goes on. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of a bondwoman because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down at a distance of about a bow shot away. For she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite of him, lifted her voice, and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." Notice again the reference to Ishmael's name here, meaning God hears or God hearkens, and referencing that God has heard the voice of the lad. Verse 18 goes on, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So some of this we're also going to leave for a future decoding when we take a look at the building of the Kaaba in a future decoding in more detail. But at this point, we do have all the information that we need to take from chapter 16 and chapter 21 of the book of Genesis from the Jewish and Christian perspective of this story. So now we're going to flip over and take a look at the Abraham and Ishmael story from the Jewish and the Christian perspectives where we just left, over to Wikipedia to find out the information you can find there to start with about the Abraham and Ishmael story through the perspective of Islamic teachings. So Wikipedia tells us here that Ishmael is the figure known in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as Abraham's or Ibrahim's son, born to Hagar. In Islam, Ishmael is regarded as a prophet and an ancestor to the prophet Muhammad. So this is why this, obviously, is such a big deal in taking a look at the story of Abraham overall, right? Because from this perspective, Ishmael, Abraham's son, is the direct ancestor of the prophet Muhammad, who ended up writing the Quran and establishing Islam. All right. So he also, Ishmael, became associated with Mecca and the construction of the Kaaba. And like I said, we're going to leave that part of the story that involves Ishmael and Abraham and the building of the Kaaba for yet another upcoming decoding when we get into more depth about the Kaaba again, as we have in our previous decoding. Wikipedia goes on to tell us that sources about Ishmael in Islam come from the Quran, the Hadith, which is a commentary on the Quran, and other Islamic texts about biblical or ancient Israelite figures that originate from Jewish or Christian sources. Wikipedia continues, "The general narrative pertaining to Ishmael in Islamic literature describes the sacrifice either as a test or as part of a vow. Some versions tell of the devil trying to stop God's command from being obeyed by visiting Hagar, Ishmael, and Abraham. Every time the devil says Abraham is going to sacrifice Ishmael, each person answers, they should obey if that's what God commanded. Eventually, Abraham tells Ishmael about God's order, and Ishmael is willing himself to be sacrificed and encourages Abraham to listen to God. In some versions, Ishmael is said to give instructions on how to bind him so that no wavering of carrying out the sacrifice will happen even by him. As Abraham attempts to slay Ishmael, either the knife is turned over in his hand or copper appears over Ishmael, preventing his death, and God tells Abraham at that point that he's fulfilled his command. In the Quran, there's no mention of a specific animal replacing the boy for sacrifice, like we saw before when we were decoding Abraham and Isaac from the Bible story. It's a ram that is substituted. Now remember, where we first saw this scapegoat element was there, and it's continuing throughout the central Genesis story in Jewish, Christian, and later on Islamic beliefs. So in Islam, a specific animal is not named in the story, but called only a great sacrifice. And that's interpreted as representing the self-sacrifice or sacrifice itself, just like the Prophet Muhammad and his descendants made for their faith. So there is a once-a-year holy day or holiday called Eid al-Adha, where Muslims around the world slaughter an animal to commemorate Abraham's sacrifice and to remind themselves of self-abnegation in the way of Allah. This entire narrative is interpreted as hospitality and obedience shown by Abraham and Ishmael, especially with Ishmael being aware of his being a sacrifice in advance and submitting to God's will anyway, an essential characteristic in Islam. There still exists a debate in Islam whether it is Isaac or Ishmael that was the son of Abraham to be sacrificed. 131 traditions say it was Isaac, and 133 say it was Ishmael. Such dispute over which son suggests that the story and where and to whom it happens is extremely important. It's argued that the story originates from rabbinic texts, that would be Jewish texts, and was adapted to Islam over time in order to give Mecca religious importance and connect the story with the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, again, this is something that we're going to get into deeper into an upcoming decoding where we look at the building of the Kaaba and Mecca story with Abraham and Ishmael. But Wikipedia continues here. Arguments by early Muslim scholars for Ishmael as the intended sacrifice include that Jews claim it's Isaac only because they're jealous, that it was actually the ancestor of the Arabs, Ishmael, and that it was the horns of the ram that was sacrificed instead of Ishmael that originally hung in the Kaaba at one time. In looking solely at the Quran to determine which son was to be sacrificed, there are still various views. The strongest case for Ishmael in the Quran is that directly after the sacrifice narrative, Abraham is told of the coming of Isaac's birth. Therefore, it must be Ishmael who was about to be sacrificed. So now we have the information that we need to decode this story about Abraham and Ishmael and what it's really talking about. So there's a lot here, so we're going to go through it one thing at a time by queuing up a screenshot from Stellarium again, looking from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective on the Earth, looking up at that very special place in the sky we've discovered is actually the secret decoder ring or the template that's being used to create all the most famous stories on Earth. A place in the sky that we've been calling the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye. Just a quick reminder, you find it by facing due south, indicated on the image by the green north-south meridian line, and where that crosses the red arc of the ecliptic down to the Earth's horizon is where to look up to find the real all-seeing eye looking back at you. Now remember when we decoded the Abraham and Isaac story from Genesis chapter 22, we learned that this story corresponds to the second week of what we commonly call March. So this is the time of year that we find that first mark of what we call daylight savings time, and what I've called the spring wink that the real all-seeing eye does, where clocks are springing forward an hour, making everything in the sky story jump back. So the screenshot notice is queued up for at a time that is opposite that sky story. So we're starting at Halloween. The first week of November is where we're going into. Remember, the 5th of November. As we looked at in our previous decoding, the Oracle decodes time travel, V for Vendetta, and the Hierophant. And in that piece, we found that there were two very famous movies, Back to the Future and V for Vendetta, that correspond to this sky story that's opposite the Abraham and Isaac almost child sacrifice story that we decoded that happens in the spring. These, Back to the Future and V for Vendetta, correspond just like this story to the fall wink. The Abraham and Ishmael story is including this second mark of daylight savings time, where clocks fall back an hour, but in the sky story, everything jumps forward. But in this story, we're also going to introduce another sky story character here that's being spoken about that we haven't yet tracked. So let's get into all of this and get to decoding what the story of Abraham and his son Ishmael is really telling us about. So to start with in Stellarium, we're queuing up a look at starting at midnight on what we commonly celebrate as Halloween. So we already know from decoding the Abraham and Isaac story in the spring, and that's during the daytime hours as we saw, that Abraham corresponds primarily to the familiar combination of constellations we've seen many times. Abraham, the quote-unquote father of these three religious nations, is the combination of Orion, and crowning this leader or father figure, Abraham in the story, is the crown of Auriga. That big baby or child in the sky tied to Orion always by the constellation Eridanus the river, as we've seen before, we're seeing again, is Cetus the whale. And it's Cetus that corresponds to Isaac, Abraham's second son that he almost sacrificed. So in Abraham's story, notice obviously he has two sons. This twinning aspect of the story again corresponds to the constellation of Gemini, the twins, found above Orion or Abraham's shoulder in the sky story picture. And don't forget, Abraham's story involves not just one, but two wives, one mother each to each of his two sons. So Gemini is doing double twin duties here. Gemini not only doubles Cetus, the child or the baby in the sky, into both Ishmael and Isaac, Abraham's two sons, but Gemini also doubles Abraham's wives, or the mothers of his two children, in combination with the constellation of Taurus the bull. Now we've seen in many previous decodings that Taurus is often chosen to represent women leaders and often mother figures or queens in these stories. Because of Taurus's location in between Orion and being crowned herself, you could say, right? Taurus is crowned also by Auriga. So Taurus is often chosen to represent the mother figure specifically, as we've seen before, because many a storyteller in the past also interpreted Taurus's shape to look to them like a woman giving birth to a child. And because of Taurus's location to the constellation of Cetus, looking like that big baby, this reference makes perfect sense when looking at the sky story picture. The angel of God sent to speak with Hagar, Ishmael's mother, in the Abraham and Ishmael story that we've been taking a look at corresponds again, as we've seen before, to the constellation of Aquarius, where the tail of stars that are coming from Aquarius's back may be reimagined to look like wings, but it also may include the constellation of Pisces here, the two fishes, reimagined as a pair of outstretched wings. So it is perhaps another constellation combination again with Pisces and Aquarius playing collectively the angel of God in the story. Central to the theme involved in both stories of Abraham's son, both Ishmael and Isaac, is the scapegoat theme, corresponding to the constellation of Capricorn the goat, and that's found on Halloween at midnight here to be descended into the Earth's horizon just up to his head. So all these elements we've looked at before in previous decodings, but a new character is here for us to watch, and that is the travels of the planet Jupiter, found in this sky story picture to be right above Cetus's head, you can see. Notice that we're looking at a screenshot of the Halloween at Midnight sky story in the year that we commonly call 2023. And we're starting here because, as we're going to learn, the story of Abraham and Ishmael directs us to look for this sky story alignment. So we're going to call this year one of the planet Jupiter's approximate 12-year cycle, and we're going to do it specifically during the fall daylight savings time of year. So what I call the fall wink, the real all-seeing eye does in the sky, is what we're looking at here. So to break this down, let's first take a look again at what happens in the sky story during this first week of what we commonly call November. What happens during this fall wink, or the daylight savings time time of year in the fall. So we're going to move ahead 3 days to what we commonly call November 2nd of 2023, And what we expect to see is what we do see here, right? Everything in the sky story is found to be a little bit more to the west when you're looking at these constellations than they were found at the same time the night before. So we're going to go forward 3 more days during this first week of November to remember the 5th of November. And we see again exactly what we do expect to see again, everything moving a little bit more westward still. And take a look at that part of the head of Capricorn. It is still visible above the western horizon, and Cetus is right at that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. But remember, when we go forward to just the next day, we find evidence of that real all-seeing eyes fall wink, where in one big jump, we see Cetus is completely crossed over to the west side of the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, and the entire constellation of Capricorn has now been sacrificed or scapegoated, all in one jump. Capricorn is fully descended into the horizon of the earth, or the scapegoat is sent out into the wilderness, or in the story we've already decoded with the almost sacrifice of Isaac, it's also the animal, the ram, that's substituted for the sacrifice instead. So we know that Cetus, that big baby in the sky, corresponds to Abraham's son Isaac, and also in part to Abraham's firstborn son Ishmael. But Ishmael is not just Cetus. It's also the specific alignment with the planet Jupiter. So let me show you why this is. So here we're going to look at the first week of November after the fall wink. Now, this is important that this daylight savings time mark has already occurred. All right, so we also are taking a look at, in this story, another child sacrifice or scapegoat theme going on here. In this story, Ishmael is either sent out to the desert wilderness with his mother in the Jewish Christian version and then saved by the angel of God from what is a similarly sounding raising up of the knife that Abraham was doing to kill his other son Isaac, but doing this instead to Ishmael in the version of this story in Islam. Now remember, Wikipedia told us that there's confusion over which son was almost sacrificed, and they're attributing this to the passing of the story down that originated in rabbinical texts or Jewish texts. And that makes sense, right? Because given the historical timeline that we're told that Judaism arose in history prior to Islam. But as we've talked about before, many of these stories go back even prior to a time before we as people had writing. So many of these stories came out of the oral tradition. So some of this explanation, they try to make sense of these confusion of jumbling up of details of the stories over great stretches of time, over many cultures, and attribute this to something like happens when, if you were a child and played the game of telephone or operator, giving the first child in the line the message and passing it down the line to the last child, you would get often a very different message at the end than the message that was started with. If you've ever played this game as a child, you know exactly what I mean. But this is not exactly what's happening between these two stories, as it turns out. The details getting confused is only if you don't know that these two stories are talking about the same overall sky story phenomenon, but at opposite times of the day and opposite times of the year. Also, that the story of Ishmael corresponds specifically to Jupiter's approximate 12-year cycle that's being tracked in this story, and it's the Jupiter element that makes it different and yet wholly interconnected to the almost child sacrifice of Isaac's story too. But we don't even need the sky story yet to comprehend from the meta-analysis perspective of the story that's given to us in the text, that either way you read the Abraham story and his two sons, you really don't have to argue between the Jewish and Christian beliefs and the believers of Islam. Either way this story goes, why is it that no one is realizing that Abraham ends up sacrificing both of his sons? Whether he's raising a knife to slay either Isaac or Ishmael, depending on which story you believe, or he's sending one of his sons, Ishmael, out into the wilderness, into the desert. Either way, we see evidence of family scapegoating, and it's the central story that connects these three famous faiths. A form of almost child sacrifice shows up over and over again throughout many stories that come after it, the scapegoating theme, including culminating with, as we'll see in future decodings, the completed child sacrifice and ultimate scapegoat story where God most famously sacrifices his own son Jesus, the sacrifice scapegoat upon which the sins of the world were placed. This is the template that's being used to preach and sell martyrdom, and the embedding of scapegoating behavior in our collective consciousness. This is evidenced by the way that we've treated each other, from our most intimate family relationships to the microcosm of how scapegoating behavior turns into things that are massive societal problems like racism, for a big example. These stories not only have to be decoded on the level of what they really mean from the sky story perspective, but also how these sky god archetypes have become embedded and made real in our own minds, and how we play these out without any mind in our real lives. This is the deeper territory that we must be willing to dive into and make changes that will have real meaning in our real lives. All right, so here in what we are going to call year 1 in Jupiter's 12-year cycle, with Jupiter right above the head of Cetus. This combination, as you'll see, is showing us the birth of Abraham's first son, Ishmael. So what we're going to do now is go year over year again, like we have before in previous decodings. And remember that we're doing this just after the fall wink time of year. So after that second daylight savings time mark. So we're looking year 2 here of Jupiter's approximate 12-year cycle, where we find Jupiter now moved to the next constellation to the east, where Jupiter is found now in Taurus. So you can think of this alignment being that Ishmael is with his mother Hagar in the story, or Hagar is delivering Ishmael to his father Abraham's or Orion's hand. Then in year 3 of Jupiter's 12-year cycle, we find Jupiter or Ishmael in the constellation of Gemini, corresponding to Hagar handing over her son to Ishmael, not only to his father Abraham, but also to Abraham's wife Sarah, who is also Hagar's mistress. So you can see all these Gemini connections. Remember, it's in the Bible story that Sarah's idea was to use her slave Hagar to produce an heir for Abraham and her. Then afterwards, Sarah is scapegoating Hagar for exactly this act. So this is Jupiter in Gemini, and this corresponds to, you can think of Sarah taking Hagar's son Ishmael for their heir. In year 4 of Jupiter's 12-year cycle, we find Jupiter this time just above the eastern horizon of the Earth. Or you can think of it as Ishmael is going to be sent out to the desert wilderness as well. All right, so for the sake of time, and this is a long one already, let's take it to the sky story all the way to year 12, the completion of Jupiter's approximate 12-year cycle, where we're going to find Jupiter back into the constellation of Cetus, just above Cetus's head, right where we started. So remember when the Bible story tells us Ishmael was born, his father Abraham was 86, and when Isaac was born, Abraham was 100, making Ishmael 14 years old when his little half-brother Isaac was born. Yet what we've just tracked with the planet Jupiter's 12-year cycle doesn't match these numbers that were given in the story, it seems. But it really does. As you've already seen, we're going to take a look at how this cycle of Jupiter that covers approximately 12 years is told within the Ishmael story, and it does sync up. So let's take it from this point and go forward another year again. So 13 years from where we started looking. Again, we find Jupiter with Taurus and Orion, or you can think of it as with Hagar and Abraham, Ishmael's parents, right? And then let's go forward another year from that. So 14 years now from where we started, when Ishmael is 14, when his baby brother or half-brother Isaac is born. The story tells us that Ishmael is 14 when Isaac's born, but thrown out into the desert with his mother right after Isaac has been weaned. Now, it's mentioned specifically that Isaac is weaned because this corresponds to the placement of Cetus and Taurus. So take a look. After the daylight savings time mark in the fall, right, that's when you can find all in one jump. The constellation of Cetus is now found to the west side of that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, being separated or weaned from his mother Sarah, or Taurus in the sky story, now found on the east side of that cross. So remember that the reason Ishmael and his mother Hagar were cast out to the desert wilderness at this time is because Sarah thought they were scoffing or laughing at her baby Isaac. Jupiter, as Ishmael, is found to be in the constellation of Gemini, the twins. So this is, remember, corresponding to the point in the story where Ishmael and Hagar are about to be cast out into the desert, and this is happening for them essentially laughing at Isaac. Why laughing? Well, that's corresponding not only to Isaac's name, but also to that fall daylight savings time mark, when the real all-seeing eye winks, as I call it. But these storytellers chose to use an up and down motion of laughing instead. And that's the reason Ishmael and Hagar, or Jupiter in alignment with Gemini, were being scapegoated by Abraham's wife Sarah for laughing at Isaac. As you can see again, the laughter of the real oracle brought the constellation of Capricorn, the scapegoat, all the way down or out into the desert wilderness, corresponding to how Ishmael and Hagar were scapegoated by both Abraham and Sarah in the story. So now you can sync up the reason why, even though Jupiter has a 12-year cycle, when you're looking at this particular sky story and tracking things, the story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac makes sense, and why it was Ishmael being almost 15 when he and his mother were cast out into the desert away from Abraham, to later become what we are told, remember, in the Bible story, Ishmael becomes an archer. Turns out just like his father, but not Abraham. Like his father in the sky story, the archer Orion, holding his bow eternally in these sky stories that have been dressed up as something else entirely. Thanks for sticking with this. I know it's been a long piece, but I think that this is a good place to end this one, and we'll take a look again at how this story continues on in future decodings. Until then, be well.